March 6, 1943, General George S. Patton arrived at the headquarters of the defeated U.S. Second Corps in Tunisia. The army he was taking command of had just suffered one of the worst defeats in American military history at the Kasserine Pass. Morale was shattered. Confidence was gone. German forces had driven the Americans backward in chaos. Patton didn't call a conference. He didn't give a speech. He began inspecting. Within minutes of assuming command, Patton reportedly relieved an officer for not wearing a helmet. But it wasn't about the helmet. It was a signal to every officer in Second Corps that the old standards were dead and new ones would be enforced immediately without exception. Patton had not come to reorganize a broken army. He had come to decide who was fit to lead it. 11 days later, that same army would stop and defeat German armor at El Guetar. To understand why Patton acted so ruthlessly, you have to understand how completely the U.S. Second Corps had failed at Kasserine Pass. In February 1943, Second Corps was new to large-scale combat. Its units were spread thin across central Tunisia, commanded by officers who had never faced a modern, mechanized enemy. When German forces struck through the Kasserine Pass, the American response was slow, fragmented, and confused. Orders moved backward and forward through multiple headquarters. Battalion and regimental commanders were often miles behind the front, relying on reports that were already obsolete by the time they arrived. When German armor broke through, there was no coordinated response, only isolated units fighting and retreating on their own. Within 48 hours, Second Corps had lost roughly 6,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment was abandoned. Positions collapsed. Several units withdrew with little coordination or clear orders. German commanders were surprised, not by American courage, but by the absence of firm leadership. Post-war interviews describe U.S. units that fought hard at the small unit level, but lacked direction from above. The problem was not the soldiers. It was the command structure that failed to control them. By the time the fighting ended, Second Corps was shaken and demoralized. It was an army that had not simply been defeated, it had lost faith in its leaders. That was the force George Patton inherited on March 6, 1943. When Patton took command of Second Corps, he did not begin by rewriting plans or reorganizing units. He began by enforcing discipline, visibly, obsessively, and without delay. Helmets were mandatory at all times, even far behind the lines. Weapons had to be clean and immediately ready for use. Uniforms were inspected, salutes were expected and returned properly. Officers who failed these standards were corrected publicly and in some cases relieved on the spot. To many, these measures seemed theatrical, even absurd. But Patton understood something critical. Discipline under pressure exposes leadership quality faster than any report or briefing. An officer who ignored small regulations, Patton believed, would ignore larger responsibilities when it mattered most. Patton made himself omnipresent. He visited the front daily, often without warning. He spoke directly to soldiers and junior officers, bypassing layers of staff. He watched how commanders positioned themselves in battle, who stayed forward and who stayed safely behind. This constant visibility sent a message throughout Second Corps. Leadership was no longer abstract or distant. Commanders were expected to see the battlefield for themselves, to make decisions quickly, and to accept responsibility for the outcome. Patton was not trying to intimidate the enemy. He was identifying which of his own officers could function under stress, and which could not. Discipline was not the goal. It was the tool he used to separate leaders from passengers. With discipline enforced, Patton moved to the real task, removing the officers he believed had failed at Kasserine. This process was swift, systematic, and unforgiving. Patton did not rely on written reports or second-hand evaluations. He judged officers by where they placed themselves in battle and how quickly they acted when under pressure. Battalion commanders who remained far to the rear were relieved without hesitation. Staff officers who delayed decisions or passed responsibility upward were removed just as quickly. Rank offered no protection. Colonels and lieutenant colonels were dismissed alongside junior officers. In many cases, there was no formal hearing, only a brief conversation and immediate reassignment. Patton believed that hesitation in combat was itself a verdict. At the same time, he promoted aggressively. Majors and lieutenant colonels who led from the front, who took initiative under fire, and who maintained control of their units were elevated regardless of seniority. Combat performance, not time and grade, became the only currency that mattered. This was not random brutality. Patton applied the same standards to everyone. Officers who understood exactly why others were removed and what was expected of those who remained. The effect was immediate. Commanders moved closer to the front, decisions were made faster, responsibility stopped being deferred. Omar Bradley, serving as Patton's deputy, played a critical stabilizing role. Where Patton applied pressure, Bradley provided continuity, ensuring the purge did not dissolve into chaos. Together, they reshaped Second Corps' leadership in less than 10 days. By mid-March, the Corps was unrecognizable, not because its soldiers had changed, but because its leaders had. Patton had not rebuilt Second Corps, he had replaced the people who failed it. The effects of Patton's purge were visible almost immediately, and not in ways that showed up on organizational charts. Second Corps had not been retrained, it had not been re-equipped. The soldiers were the same men who had retreated through Kasserine just weeks earlier. What changed was how they were led. Officers were suddenly present at the front. Battalion and regimental commanders positioned themselves where they could see the fight, not where they could avoid it. Decisions that once took hours were now made in minutes. Orders were shorter, clearer, and more decisive. Just as importantly, soldiers noticed. They saw their commanders sharing risk, enforcing standards, and accepting responsibility. Confidence does not return because the enemy had become weaker. It returned because leadership had become visible and predictable. Patton's inspections and sudden appearances reinforced this shift. Commanders understood that performance mattered every day, not just during major engagements. There was no safe distance from accountability. This change in behavior mattered more than any tactical adjustment. Second Corps had not learned new ways to fight German armor. It had learned how to function as a coherent force under pressure. For the first time since arriving in North Africa, Second Corps behaved like an army that expected to hold its ground. On March 23, 1943, German forces launched a major armored attack against the U.S. Second Corps near the El Ghetar Pass in central Tunisia. The terrain was narrow, the pressure intense, and the stakes clear. This was exactly the kind of battle that had shattered Second Corps at Kasserine. This time, the outcome was different. When German armor advanced, American units held their positions. Artillery was coordinated quickly and decisively. Infantry did not collapse or withdraw without orders. Commanders remained forward, directing the fight as it unfolded rather than reacting from a distance. German tanks were stopped and destroyed as they pushed into the pass. The attack stalled, then failed. Second Corps held its ground and broke the momentum of the German attack. The contrast with Kasserine was unmistakable. 11 days earlier, confusion had spread faster than orders. At El Ghetar, decisions were made rapidly and responsibility was clear. Units knew who was in charge, and commanders knew they would be judged by their actions under fire. El Ghetar was not a flawless victory. Losses were taken and mistakes were made, but Second Corps did not break. Against a veteran German force, it stood its ground and fought as a coordinated army. The transformation was undeniable. The same soldiers using the same equipment had produced a radically different result. The difference was leadership. The effects of Patton's purge did not end at El Ghetar. Its consequences followed the army into Europe. The officers Patton retained and promoted in Second Corps formed the core of America's future combat leadership. Men like Omar Bradley, Ernest Harmon, and Lucien Truscott went on to command divisions, corps, and armies in the campaigns that followed: Sicily, Normandy, and the drive into Germany. Their rise was not accidental. They had proven they could lead under pressure, close to the fighting, and without hesitation. Those Patton relieved faced a very different fate. Many were reassigned to training commands or staff roles far from combat. Some remained in the army for the rest of the war, but very few returned to frontline leadership. In Patton's system, failure at Kasserine was not a temporary setback. It was a final judgment. This created a lasting divide within the officer corps. Combat command was no longer guaranteed by seniority or reputation. It had to be earned and defended under fire. Patton's decision in March 1943 quietly shaped who would lead American soldiers for the rest of the war. History remembers George Patton for his battles, his speed, his aggression, and his relentless drive across Europe. But his most important victory may have come long before that, in North Africa, after defeat. Patton did not save Second Corps by inventing new tactics or giving inspirational speeches. He saved it by enforcing accountability without exception and by deciding who was allowed to lead in combat and who was not. In just 10 days, he transformed a broken force not by changing the soldiers, but by changing the standards. Leadership was no longer symbolic or distant. It was visible, immediate, and unforgiving. The lesson of Second Corps is not that harsh leadership is always right, it's that in moments of crisis, culture changes fastest when failure has consequences. Patton understood that an army does not rise to its ideals. It falls to the level the leadership tolerates.